For over 20 some years, I've been working with motor carriers throughout Colorado and a few across the nation. And forever, people have struggled with the short haul rules. Well, on September 29th of 2020, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety updated those rules, and these new rules are going to be absolutely awesome. And in this video, for property carrying commercial motor vehicles, I'm going to be going over the short haul requirements so that you and your team can get this right and avoid those costly fines or possibly even out of service orders. Welcome back to D.O.T. University. I'm Ryan, the D.O.T. guy. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so that you can be notified whenever we're coming out with the new materials. That way you can stay off the radar. All right, let's get into this. Hours of service short haul for property carriers. Now, this one, you have options for both, for CDL and for non-CDL operations. And we're going to break down both of these parts and the rules and regulations. But just understand, this is a great rule for you. It got really messed up clear back in 2005. But with this update that we got in September 29th of 2020 for CDL operations, it made this rule absolutely usable. For years, motor carriers would use this rule and this exception, and they would see that it was hurting them, that they weren't following all the parts of the provisions because they weren't reading the whole thing. But with the changes that we have to the new rule, this is going to be absolutely outstanding for everybody. Now, to get a complete understanding of the short haul operations, we need to refer to the federal regulations. So if we go to the federal book and we look at 49 CFR 395.1, we'll find the two exceptions for short haul operations for both CDL and non-CDL operations. Now, what this provides is an exception from logbooks and ELDs and even supporting documents. So when we get into the regulation 395.E1, the 150 air mile radius driver, the September 29th of 2020 update to this says that for CDL operators, the number one part of this, the first point, is that they stay within 150 air mile radius, or equivalent to 172.06 statute miles of the normal work reporting location. So means they're local. They have to stay within that area of wherever they started their shift for that day. The second point of this says that driver has to return at the end of their shift to that work reporting location within 14 hours. That's part of the update also, because for a CDL driver, they have always been limited to 12-hour days. So now the extension to that is going to be within that 14-hour day, as long as they do return to the work reporting location. Now that's important because if they go to a different location, such as starting at the office and then taking the truck to their residence at the end of their day, they will lose that exception. Now the third point that goes with this is that the driver, they have to have at least 10 consecutive hours off, separating each of their 14-hour tours of duty. So 10 hours off. Now, if you look at that, that does account for their full 24-hour day. A 14-hour work day, 10 hours off. Tomorrow, they're eligible to start again. Now, this will become troublesome if they work longer than 14 hours. Then they're not going to be able to come back in tomorrow at the same work reporting time that they're used to. They will have to come in a little bit later. They have to make sure, they as the driver has to make sure that they're getting 10 hours off. Now, lastly, so important is that the motor carrier maintains accurate time records of their start time, stop time, and total hours for the day for 6 months. Now, if it's a non-CDL, again, referring to the federal regulations, 395.1, for non-CDL operations, it's also providing an exception from logbooks and ELDs and supporting documents. But additionally, we're getting an extension on 2 days on the 14-hour rule. So again, we have the 150 air mile radius for non-CDL operations, and it is telling us that obviously the driver's got to stay within that air mile radius, 150 miles, and the driver has to report back to their work reporting location at the end of their tour of duty each day. Now, during this time, for a non-CDL driver, this is saying that the driver does not drive more or after, I should say, the end of the 14th hour of coming on duty, 5 days a week. And then they do have 2 days that they're permitted to go more than 14 up to 16, as long as they don't drive after the 16th hour of coming on duty 2 days a week. Now, this doesn't mean that a driver can go through and work 5 14-hour days and then have 2 16-hour days, because that'll put them way over on their 70 or 60-hour rules, whichever that company is claiming. You cannot forget the 395.3, the maximum drive time for property carriers, and I'll talk about that a little later in this video, but we have to make sure that we adhere to still the 60 or the 70-hour rule, whichever the company is claiming. Now, additionally, these drivers do have to have accurate time records that record the time that that driver started and stopped their shift. All right. Let's go ahead and see, now that we're past the rules and regulations, let's go ahead and see if we can get into the rest of this presentation and see if we can have a little fun with this information and make it a little bit easier. Now, I want to try to make this as easy as I possibly can. So what I've done is I created a flow chart to help this flow a little bit easier so it breaks it down when you see it. So let me just kind of zoom in on this so we can see it just a little bit better. Now, in this flow chart, I took the very last thing of the regulation. That's going to be the part that absolutely everybody forgets about. Now, that's going to be, we're going to start up here in this upper corner, and it's going to say, do you keep a daily time card? Now, a time card, you'll notice over here on this side, I have this additional little point on here. And basically what that says is your time record has to consist of the following: the daily time, the start that the driver starts their shift, the end of their shift, and the total time. And then the last thing is going to be the total time for the preceding 7 days. So you need to have in your time cards, you can track the total time in the office, but you and your drivers have to track the time that they start their shift, they stop their shift, and the total hours. Okay, common mistakes that happen with this is you as a motor carrier are recording job site time because that's your billable hours, but you're not recording the time that the driver actually reported for work. So your time card has to show the time that they show up at the office. You can still break out your billable time for billing, but you have to show the D.O.T. and you have to track the time that they were actually at your office in readiness for work. The other mistakes that you'll see is you'll see time cards where drivers just record, well, today I worked 8 hours. Yesterday, I worked 9 hours. The day before that, I worked 9.5 hours. That doesn't work either because we're missing the start time, the stop time, and all we have is the total time. So you have to make sure that you're recording that. I'll show you an example of a time card so you can see that point a little bit clearer. Now, I want to point out this statement also that I've put in this top box, okay? It says salaried employees included. Oh my goodness. I go into companies all the time and we start talking about hours of service, and I'll say, hey, show me old Joe's time records. And they look at me and they say, well, old Joe doesn't have time records because he's salary. Listen, y'all, the DOT doesn't care how you're paid, but they do care that everybody who's driving a commercial motor vehicle has a form of a time record. You either have to have a record of duty status, ROD, or you have to have an ELD, or you're going to have the time card if you're claiming this exception. It's really simple. If old Joe doesn't want to do a time card, okay, no problem. Then he has to be in an ELD. So you got to get past that salaried employee thing really quick, because you have to answer yes to every one of these questions to get down to this bottom box that says no logbook is required. So we're going to start here at the top. And it says, first off, do you, your driver, now you could be referring to your drivers, do you, the driver could be referring to themselves, so on and so forth. But with this one, do you keep a daily time card? Sure. Start, stop, total hours. We've got that covered. When we come down here to this next question, it says, have you stayed within 150 air mile radius of your work reporting location? Okay, I'll show you some maps. That's a pretty good sized circle. Next question, if we answer yes to that, it says, are you released off duty at the same, or off duty within 14 hours at the same work reporting location, meaning you had to go back to where you started, okay? If you answer yes to that, then it takes you down to this last question of, have you taken at least 10 consecutive hours off duty between your shifts? If you answer yes to every one of these questions, then you land down here that you do not have to do a logbook. Okay, that's happened, right? We've done it, we're good to go, and we should be 100% compliant. However, if we answer no to any of these questions, then that takes us down here to the bottom of the chart. And when we start looking at the bottom of the chart, that drops down to say, well, a logbook is required, and you have to do this logbook. Now, with the ELD exception, we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, you do have some limitations. You can still do a few paper logs, but there are limits on there. Now, some special notes that I put down here on this flow chart to really help you keep track of it. The 30-minute rest break. Okay, they don't apply to short haul operations. They did cut that out, so you don't have to do short haul operations. If you lose your short haul somewhere in the middle of the shift, for instance, a driver becomes aware that they're not going to make it back within 14 hours, or they're going to cross that 150 air mile radius boundary and then still drive back, that's fine. They just have to do a logbook. But if they have not done their 30-minute rest break, it's super important that when you fill out your log, you have to fill it out for all the information previous on that. Then that log, you need to make sure that an annotation is put on there to explain why that driver did not take that 30-minute rest break. Now, it doesn't have to be a big novel. It can just say claiming short haul or lost short haul at this point. Then it's expected that that driver pulls over at their next safe location. We don't want you stopping on the side of the highway. That's where people get hit and accidents happen. Don't stop on the side of the highway. Get to a good safe location and then pull off and take that 30-minute rest. Now, one of the updates that we have is that 30-minute rest can be just 30 minutes of uninterrupted time. But you might still be in the clear because you only have to take the 30-minute rest now for every 8 hours of actual drive time. So if your driver spent most of the day working in the field and just say they had an hour and a half driving to location, working in the field, and an hour and a half driving home, they're not going to be subject to the 30-minute rest break rule either. Now, before we got this update from the rules from 2013, you bet they had to take that 30-minute rest break because it counted all on duty, but not anymore. So that was also a really good update. Now, I also put a special note on here that the 60 or 70 hour rule, they do apply to us. Okay, now that's also super important, and I'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. The 16-hour long day, that rule can be still used by your CDL driver, okay? But remember, it's more than 14 hours, so they're going to have to do a log if they are calculating that. And then remember, for your ELDs, you're permitted to do up to 8 paper logs in a 30-day period. No more than that. If you have to do more, then everything has to be recorded on an ELD device. Now, when I say 30-day period, I'm not talking about 30 or I'm not talking about a month. I'm talking about 30 days. That's a sliding scale. So it could be the 1st through the 30th. It could be the 2nd through the 31st, or it could be the 14th through the 15th, however that lays out. Okay. Now this next flow chart that we have, this is going to be for non-CDL drivers. This is, again, just a little bit of a different regulation. It gives them one more exception that the CDL drivers don't have. But non-CDL drivers, everything is pretty much the same, except for they throw in that 2 16-hour days that you can have. You still have to have a time card. That time record still has to be the same: the time of the start of the shift, the time of the end of shift, and the total hours of on duty for the day. That has to be recorded. And then that takes us to our next topic. Okay, has the driver stay within 150 air miles of the work reporting location? Exactly the same. So that one's pretty simple. Then we drop down here. This is where it kind of gets a little bit confusing because we have these 2 options. Now, I don't like to forecast to companies that, hey, you get 2 options. You can have 2 16-hour days, because companies will start saying, oh, hey, we're going to work that time. And then at the end of the week, we see that they're way over on their 70 hours, and then they're getting in trouble for that. So you want to try to stick to your 14-hour days the best you can. But this is nice because if your job site runs a little bit long in the middle of the week, you do have a little bit of leniency that you can pull out a 16-hour day, okay? Or we should say more than a 14-hour day, because if it's 14 and a half hours, that'll take up this exception. If it's 15 hours, that'll take up this exception. It just allows you to have that little bit of an extra day. But make sure you're monitoring your 60 and your 70-hour rule, whichever one you're claiming. Now, lastly, if you answer yes to these, that you're keeping your time within that drops you down again to your 10-hour rest between your shifts, and then to no logs required. Now, the exact same thing once we get to the end of this flow chart, if we answer no to anything, then that means we have to do a logbook. And all the same things that I just spoke about on the previous slide holds true to this one. That if you hadn't taken your rest break, you need to at this particular point. You have to fill out the entire log and you have to count for the entire day. Now, your exceptions on ELDs, okay? So short haul it's the number one reason why drivers, they don't need to do an ELD. When they came out with this, a couple years ago, and they announced that the reasons was old trucks, 1999 and older, you don't have to have an ELD, still do paper logs, drive away towaways. So I understood those two. I wasn't too excited about the older truck thing because I saw a lot of companies go out and trying to resurrect trucks from the graveyard so that they didn't have to put the ELDs in there. We're kind of getting past that. Companies are really starting to get used to these ELD programs, unless you got suckered into one of the really crappy ones that are out there. But try to get into one of the newer units. I can make some recommendations, some really good software programs that are built for you. Okay, so since it became the number one reason, everybody decided we're going to go back and try to be short haul, which it's been an absolute nightmare up until September 29th of 2020 with the new rule. So once they change that to this new rule, we're really on track to something great, I believe, with this new update. Now, drivers, again, I got to stress, you can still complete a records of duty status, a ROD, okay, for up to eight of those in a 30-day period. Any more than that, then you're stuck with this. You have to have an ELD. But generally, you're good with just doing the log. Now, remember, when you're filling this out, you need to train your drivers how to fill that out because they're going to get judged on it and that type of thing. Now, a lot of questions that I get when doing the log is, well, what if I'm short haul, but tomorrow I'm going to go a little bit further? Okay, I am going to talk a little bit about that. So hold that question for me because it is super important how you proceed with that. I see a lot of drivers that'll go through and just pre-fill out logs from the day previous saying that they were off duty, and that way they can present those. I can tell you right now, that's a no-no. If you get stopped by the wrong inspector, all that inspector has to do is call your company and say, hey, was old Joe working the last 7 days? And if they say, yeah, he was, all of a sudden now old Joe's holding a false log. So don't do that, okay? The rules say that if you're short haul, you don't have to recreate your logs. You only have to have the logs available for your trip. So when you get pulled over and the officer walks up and says, hey, I'm Trooper so-and-so, I need your driver's license, your medical card, your proof of insurance, your logbook. Well, when that driver says, well, I only have one page for my log, the officer's follow-up question is going to be, well, how come? Why? Okay. If the driver just kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, well, gee, I don't know. My company didn't make me fill one out. You're probably going to get placed out of service for 10 hours because that is the standard practice. But if your driver says, well, I'm short haul for those previous days and I'm just running out to do this trip, run out today, and I'm going to be back tomorrow, I'll only do 2 logs this month, they're going to drop it right there. Okay. They may ask him a few more questions, but they generally will drop it. All right, now I want to get into your time records. So I'm going to give you a pro tip here, and this is going to get kind of in the weeds a little bit because this is where things get really super confusing. I've seen officers doing audits that just have gotten completely discombobulated with these topics. So you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. When you go through a review, when I look at a driver, it's the presumption that he's a driver, he or she is driving all the time. All right. So if they're not driving or if they're not driving a regulated vehicle, their time while working for you is still tracked because it still counts against the 60 or the 70-hour rule. But if I'm not driving a commercial motor vehicle, then that time isn't D.O.T. regulated. Okay. So how, if somebody's local and they're just doing a time card, or maybe they didn't do a time card, which is going to get them in hot water too, then how am I going to go through and show that I have this time card? So we want to really make sure that we zero in on this. So this is an example time card that we love to give our clients here at Front Range Compliance Services. And with this one, it's a 7-day time card. But the point that I'm really trying to drive home on this is the driver can go through, they can fill this out. They can put in their date. They can put in their power unit number, okay? And if they didn't drive, like say maybe they're driving, a 2500 series, which is 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating. That vehicle all by itself is not considered a commercial motor vehicle. However, if I hook up to a trailer, the combination's now going to go over the 10,000 pounds, and depending on whatever your state ratings are, it's going to be a commercial motor vehicle. So in that case, it's really important if I drive a trailer, I put that trailer unit number right in here. Because if I don't record the trailer unit number, then that's going to be a lot easier for you to prove that that driver was not driving a commercial motor vehicle on that day. So then you can also record, of course, the requirement, the start of the shift, the end of the shift, and the total hours for the day. And if there's a recap, this is where you recap your hours. You can go through and total those up through the week. So your driver will know where they're at come Friday or Saturday to make sure that he or she does not drive more than the required time. Now, the other thing in the notes, you can go through and put in, a little bit more information about that event, maybe to help you recall it. Maybe something special happened on that event, that driving, like an adverse condition or something like that. You can record those in the notes section. All right, the 150 air mile radius. Okay, the equivalent of 172.6 statute miles. Now, this is kind of a blown up version, or not a blown up, but it's not zeroed in, just to kind of show you about how big that circle is. So this is right over the state of Colorado. I love to use state of Colorado because that is the home of Front Range Compliance and D.O.T. University. But these rules apply no matter where you're at inside the United States. Okay. So again, we've got this radius. You can see this radius goes through and it spans up into Wyoming. We got a little bit of Nebraska here. We're right here on the border, so we don't go into Kansas. Okay, so we'd go into 3 states with this radius of exactly where that's at right now. So if we go through and we look at this, like a blown up version of this, okay, you can see first off what this radius looked like as both the previous circle and the outer circle. So previously, for CDL operations, it was 100 air mile radius. And that's going to be a representation of what that looked like on the inside. So on September 29th of 2020, when they expanded this to the 150 air mile radius, that it was quite a big circle and quite a big difference there. Okay. So overall, I think this is going to be, really, really great. Now, let's kind of zero in on this. One of the questions that I get is, well, I'm a short haul driver, so you're not allowed to cross state lines. Now, I've gotten this from motor carriers, but I've also had enforcement officers up here in this little town that have shut drivers down that have come out of Colorado and into the Cheyenne area. They get shut down, and I call the enforcement officer, and the enforcement officer tells me, well, they can't because you can't drive interstate commerce and short haul. That is total BS. If you're getting told that by anybody, you know what? Tell them to RTFB. Read the federal book, because when you go to the applicabilities of 395, it says that these rules are applicable to interstate commerce. So we just solved that point right there. Yes, absolutely. You can drive across state lines. Okay. Now, the next thing that we run into, let's kind of talk about a couple scenarios that can happen with this. So if we go through and we utilize, now I'm going to have some fun with my pen on this, trying to make these points. So one of the things that we can have happen is we can have this truck, he starts his shift, say at 7 o'clock in the morning. Now remember, it's a 14-hour day, so 7 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. This driver can now drive around within this circle pretty much all he or she wants to do, as long as they still shouldn't exceed the 11-hour rule, the maximum drive time, but they can drive around within that radius. They can drive more than 170 miles. They just can't drive more than 170 miles in one direction, 172.6 to be exact, from their work reporting location. But we've got the air mile radius figured out on here. Now, I will tell you this, I will do a video in the future to show you how to draw these maps so that you can use them in your office, okay? It's really not that difficult, but I'll show you a couple different ways that you can put these together. Now, with this, let's go ahead and run through a couple scenarios. Now, it says, first off, the driver has to have a time record, okay? So we're going to say the driver's got that. The next thing that goes through and says is that this driver, they have to start and stop their shift at the same work reporting location. Now, this is a pretty good size area. So if this driver were to go up here and they were going to head up I-25 and say they work here at Chugwater, okay? And they work up there, and then at the end of their shift, they turn around and they head back home. Okay, that's great. As long as they did that within 14 hours, they're claiming the exception. But let's say that this driver, they're going up there to do a job, so they're going to move. Now this area is going to, when they drive up here and they still stayed within the radius, okay, but they didn't return back to their work reporting location. Let's say they stayed at the Holiday Inn Express up there in Chugwater. Now at that particular point, that becomes their new work reporting location. So if they're working up here, say Monday through Friday, then this will become their new. Now, this is, of course, not to scale at all, but that would become their new 150 air mile radius. So tomorrow, when they start their shift, then they can start at the hotel, start this, make sure to log on their time record, the start of their shift, and they can drive to their job site and back. And they can do this basically all week long. Okay. Now, here's the deal. When they come home on Friday, okay, they're going to turn around and they're going to take this trip back to their terminal, and that is fantastic. The only problem is they're not returning back to the Holiday Inn Express, so they're going to have a logbook. So all of their time while they were up in Chugwater working on that job, they had to have a time card for the Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. But on Monday and Friday, they were going to have logs. Now remember that, because my scenario that I talk about, we want to know that that week has 2 logs. Now that's great. If that's your standard operation and you do that every week, the reason that that's important is because by the end of the month, if you've got a long month, or the 30-day period breaks out over 5 days, if every Monday I drive to a location and then I drive back on Friday, if I do that over the course of 30 days, that's going to be 9 records of duty status. So you will not qualify for paper logs anymore. You're going to have an ELD to record those trips. Now, this is, again, like I said, this starts getting pretty confusing. Doesn't mean you still can't claim short haul. While he was working here in this Chugwater area, okay, you can still do the time cards, but your logbooks to record everything driving back home when you come back, whichever way you're going, those still would have to be recorded on an ELD. If it was more than 8 times, 8 paper logs had to be done in that 30-day period. Okay. Other situations that can happen is you can have this driver go in, they can load up, okay, and they can run out, and they can say right here at Sedgwick, okay, you're kind of right on the border, so you got to be really super careful with that, because when we start getting into some of these tighter towns where we're going to, it can start to get pretty confusing. Now, I have literally gotten phone calls from people that I've made this map for, and they'll call me and they'll use like the Saratoga example, and they'll say, "Hey Ryan, I'm looking at your map and it's really helpful, but that line's kind of thick, and I don't know if the 150 air mile radius is at the start of the line or at the back of the line. Can you help me out?" Okay, all I can tell you is don't be that guy. Okay, if you're bouncing off of that line within your daily activities, do the paper log, okay? Because there's going to be an enforcement officer out there that's going to pull it out, and he's going to zero in with GPS on your locations. And if it's more than 150 air mile radius, you're going to get a violation. Your driver's going to get put out of service. So if you're right up against that line, make sure that you're doing the record of duty status. Don't be difficult in that. Now, a couple points that I want to make before we finish this up is the general hours of service rules. They still apply, okay? A few of these that I want to talk about. The 10 hours consecutive rest between your shifts, that applies to all drivers, okay? If they're driving a regulated vehicle. Now, if I was driving a Ford F-150 today and I'm driving a Ford F-150 tomorrow, my gross vehicle weight rating is only 7,500 pounds. So I'm not a commercial motor vehicle during that time. However, okay, if I hook up to a trailer, I'm more than likely going to go over that weight rating, so I'm going to be regulated. Now, today, if I'm just driving that Ford F-150, then tomorrow I'm pulling a trailer. If I only got, 8 hours off of my shift, I'm not eligible to drive tomorrow a regulated vehicle because I didn't get 10 hours off. Okay, I would only be allowed to drive just the Ford F-150 without a trailer. Okay, I feel like I'm getting a little bit into the weeds on this. I don't want to make this too foggy for everybody, because this is where it really gets confusing with some of these deeper topics. Another rule that we run into is the 14-hour rule. Now, there is that exception, okay, that's for the non-CDL drivers. They can have those 2 days up to 16 hours, but general purposes, 14-hour rule, it still applies. Nobody should work more than 14 hours. Now, of course, there's the 16-hour long day, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, the 60-hour rule and the 70-hour rule, okay, they're not one and the same. And you talk to most motor carriers and you all say, oh, we're 70-hour rule. We work 70 hours. But then you start talking to them. Remember, if you do not work every day of the week, like if your company closes down and is shut down every Sunday, you can't claim 70 hours because 70 hours is designed for those companies who work every day of the week. So if your company does shut down, you cannot claim the 70-hour rule. Okay, so it's 60 hours in a 7-day period. If you're a 70-hour company, it's 70 hours in an 8-day period. Now, both of those periods can be reset by taking 34 hours off. Videos to come. Check out our videos on the 60 and 70-hour rules. I'll get into the basic hours of service just to make sure y'all get that information. It's just this one is a really hot button right now. The other big one, this is not necessarily a general rule, but it's an exception that's out there. And it's commonly, since ELDs came out, they referred to it as the 16-hour long day. I absolutely hate that term, but that's what they call it. But in the regulations, it's called the property carrier exception. It's still, remember to claim that, you have to be a local driver. If you're over the road, you don't get this one, okay? If you're over, or if you're a local driver, you can work up to 16 hours, 1 day a week in between your resets. Again, this is for your CDL operations. As long as for the previous 5 shifts, you were started and stopped at the same work reporting location. Again, I'm going to be having a video come out on the specific hours of service exemptions, so I will talk to you specifically about that one. All right, so that brings us to the end. That's a lot of information in a really short period of time. So if you get confused on that, rewind, rewatch, see if you can grasp what you're saying. If I totally lost you in the weeds, hey, I'm sorry. Shoot us a comment and we'll get to that. Or you can email us at info@frontrangecompliance.com. We'll try to get back with you as quickly as possible. And other than that, remember, be safe out there. Thank you for everything that you do. Your transportation is keeping the world flowing.